Well, thank you very much, and thanks to RMS for giving us a chance to talk a little bit about the history of the James River in Richmond. The last 75 years have been clearly one of Richmond's great success stories. And by the way, there are few copies of the book in the auction, so buy up all of those copies of the book in the auction that you have going. This is the stretch of the river that we'll be talking about. Let me let Nathan take it over and talk a little bit about that.
As we look to the history of the James River, especially here in the city of Richmond, the majority of this discussion will really center around the view that you see here. The view that you see here in the map in front of you is of the James River Park System, a 600-acre natural area park in the middle of our capital city. What we like to say here in Richmond is that it's a little bit of wilderness in the heart of the city. Over 250 acres are actually in a conservation easement. This is a unique conservation easement for an urban environment. It's not contiguous. There are a number of different parcels that make up the James River Park System that are in conservation, with additional 300 acres being sought to be placed under conservation easements. The James River Park System today sees over 2 million visitors and is a $33.5 million asset to the city of Richmond. Mind you, they don't charge you to go to the James River Park System. You get to go enjoy it for free. And so the multitudes of people that end up enjoying the riverfront here in the city of Richmond also end up spending their dollars in surrounding communities, at businesses, at bars, at restaurants, all contributing to the vitality of the city of Richmond as well as the riverfront. Today, the James River Park System truly is seen as the great wet central park of our region, and truly is this microcosm of our city itself and of our state, where various communities, various individuals from multitude of backgrounds come and enjoy the outdoors. So this stretch of the river is really kind of be the focal point of our discussion today. But as you'll learn through this discussion, the riverfront wasn't always as loved or as well known as it is today. And so I'll hand it back to my friend Ralph to carry us through the beginning.
I like to think of, if you look at rivers in a very broad way, I like to think of three periods of river history. A natural period that lasted thousands or really millions of years, in which there was very little human impact on the river. The utility period, which occurred for hundreds of years in this country and probably a lot more in other countries, in which the river was considered just a tool, something to help with the economics and industry that human beings were interested in. The character of the river itself was of little consequence. And then finally, the current period, I call it the amenity period, just dozens of years. This is just beginning, in which the river is really considered much more a function of providing recreation, providing enjoyment to human beings. A nice thing about the amenity period is that the more natural it is, the more it serves its amenity function. The transformation that's underway, I would argue, is from the river as a tool, as a utility, to the river as an amenity. And kind of my shorthand for that was from sewer to park. I might mention in passing that originally I was going to call the book From Sewer to Park, but the publisher didn't like the word sewer in the title, so that got knocked out. There were the major transformation themes are two: the health of the river and access to the river. Let's take a quick look at conditions in Richmond at mid-century. The James River in Richmond, number one, was polluted, and we'll talk more about that in a second. There were threats to the river at that time, the expressway and other development threats along the river. There was no public access. The downtown riverbanks were cluttered with abandoned industry. The canals had been disrupted and threatened. Dams were blocking fish passage. There were floods. Views were obstructed and threatened. And fundamentally, the river was ignored. Talking about going to the river in those days meant going to some other river, not to the James River. At some point, who knows when, Richmond remembered the value of the jewel in its midst. Great accomplishments depend on a vision, and the vision of a Richmond centered on the James pleases the eye and invigorates the spirit. That was an editorial in the Richmond Times-Dispatch back in 1996. Now, the vision of what the river could be was not something that came along in some sudden epiphany. It began and barely and has grown over time and is continuing to grow. So it was a gradual kind of thing which continues to this day. The first big issue to deal with was pollution. Giving real meaning to the notion of the river as a utility, as a tool, was the statement of a Virginia legislator in 1912, who supposedly said the rivers of Virginia are the God-given sewers of the state. And indeed they were. After the Civil War, one of the great inventions was indoor toilets. And one of the ways that indoor toilets worked was that they ran directly to the river. And that practice continued for 100 years, really. This quote gives you an idea of how polluted the James was back in mid-century, the middle part of last century. Beside the creek's deserted upper terminal, Gillies Creek pours raw sewage into the river. At the mouth of the creek, a large circle of green scum widens turgidly. Odor of sewers and of things long dead clutches at the nostrils. Here, no aquatic life of any sort survives. Our river is a sewer. And indeed it was. There was a beginning back in the middle century, a beginning that had a lot of resistance from the city. In 1946, the State Water Control Law was passed. The State Water Control Board told the cities to get on the ball to construct a sewage treatment facility. And the city said to the State Water Control Board, hey, we would like to do it, but it costs too much money. So we're not going to do anything right now. And that resistance was supported actually by lots of people, a former mayor, some members of the General Assembly, and the Richmond Times-Dispatch that said this: we endorse and believe in the anti-pollution program. But I can't read it because there's something on my screen there. But the pollution has been going on for generations, even centuries, and we do not believe that Richmond's present financial condition justifies the expenditure of $13 million, one single capital project over a 4-year period. But a decision was made to proceed. In 1958, a water treatment facility was begun. Interceptors to capture the flow of sewage down the hill into the river were constructed in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and forward. And the combined sewer overflow problem was tackled beginning in about the 1970s. The CSO, the combined sewer overflow problem, was one of those nagging ones that just kept going and going for a long period of time. Both the sewage and stormwater went into the same pipe and everything worked very well if there wasn't much of a storm. But when there was a storm, it all combined together and overflowed into the river. There were two options considered to resolve the combined sewer overflow problem. One of them was just to physically separate those sewer lines, and you have one stormwater sewer and one wastewater wastewater line. The second was the construction of large holding basins to contain overflows until the excess volume could be treated. The decision was the holding basin. There was, however, one dissenter, Newton and Caro, who said, I am told it would cost upward of 300 million to separate the sewers in Richmond, but so be it. But let me have Nathan tell you a little bit about Newton and Caro. He was quite a character in his time in Richmond.
So in order to really make a working riverfront become a recreational amenity, it took a lot of characters, and Richmond was not short on characters. Newton and Caro happened to be one of them. Newton and Caro, he was a businessman. He built speedboats at Ann Caro's Landing. Newton and Caro, also because he was a businessman, he understood that, well, my livelihood actually depends on this river and the health of the river. So famously, Newton and Caro became one of the first in Richmond environmentalists. He began to take pictures all along the James, on many islands, along the ancestral banks, and began a very savvy campaign of working directly with garden clubs. Who had the power back then? The women. They were at home. They were making lots of the decisions for the families, and were also very influential in Richmond at that point in time. So he went to the garden clubs, began speaking to various garden clubs around Richmond, getting them on board with, we really need to improve the health of the river. But as Ralph showed, the capital outlier for such a venture was a staggering number at that point in time. But Newton and Caro pressed on. He famously went into a city council meeting where they were talking about the health of the river and whether or not to move forward with this capital outlay to develop a combined sewer overflow system as well as the sewage treatment plant. He goes into the council meeting. He brings in a gurney with him. On that gurney is a white sheet. He stands in front of city council. You say that the river is clean. Well, what do you say about this? And he rips the sheet off. Under the sheet are jars full of river water with raw effluent, with fish that have fins only on one side, dead aquatic creatures. You say the health of the river is clean. I can tell you it's not. And he shows them. What's the response? The city ends up building the wastewater treatment plant, but they did so by taking Newton and Caro's land. They ended up not using the part of his land for the development of the facility. Today, it is actually known as Ann Caro's Landing and is the only motorized boat access point within the city of Richmond limits. But Newton and Caro, his efforts, back in the early 1970s, to really bring to the forefront the issue of the health of the river, really was kind of, he was the forebearer of the environmental movement here in the city of Richmond.
Thank you, Nathan. There's a little thing. One of the interesting pieces of history is that the city and all agencies that had the decision to make actually approved using part of the James River and Kanawha Canal, an area known as Richmond Dock, just upstream from Great Shiplock, as the retention basin. They were going to line this with concrete and use this as the retention basin. But there was a great deal of protest, and that decision was reversed. Instead, the Shockoe Retention Basin was built in 1983, holding millions of gallons of water. And then in 2003, the Hampton-McCloy Tunnel was built as another retention basin. And this captures the first flush, the dirtiest of the water, and holds it until it can be piped across the river to the wastewater treatment facility. There were lots of organizations that really lobbied in favor of doing something about the combined sewer overflow. And those organizations, the federal government was one, the James River Association, it was the Lower James at that time, provided awards to the city for what they'd done with the combined sewer overflow problem. Still, there's a good deal more to do. The CSO problem is still not entirely solved. As a matter of fact, the General Assembly this last time around got on the city's case and said, you've got only a certain number of years left and you got to get that problem fully solved. Reducing stormwater pollution is something that needs to be done, stream restoration, continuing to upgrade the treatment facility, and of course, educating the public and pet owners and others. But a good deal had been done. But let's go on. While that was all going on, there was another threat to the integrity of the river. That was the expressway that was part of the Richmond Metropolitan Authority plan in 1966. That expressway would have been placed right along this stretch of the river that you see here. It would have covered the spot that's captured in this picture. But there was immediate protest. The Stratford Hill Citizens Committee was formed, and later the Richmond Scenic James Council was formed to resist the construction of that expressway. The motto of the protesters was, once destroyed, it can never be replaced. And indeed, that would have been the case. Key events, one was discover the James on Columbus Day, ironically, the same day that further downstream, the James River Park was dedicated. In that event, people were invited to come see what the expressway would do to the river. And they dramatized that by putting markers out in the middle of the river where the expressway would extend, putting ribbons high, well up onto trees showing how high the expressway would go, and provided other talks and ways to demonstrate the negative impact on the river. An additional event was a joint meeting with Richmond Scenic James Council and Richmond City Council. That was a meeting just between those two groups, not a regular meeting, but a special meeting in which the Richmond Scenic James Council made its argument against the expressway being built. And eventually their argument carried the day. I think not only did that effort end up helping prevent the construction of that expressway, which would have had a major negative impact on the river, would have destroyed a large portion of it, but I think it symbolized an emerging appreciation of the river. At that time, the lowlands around the river were considered not very valuable property. They flooded and not much could be done, so they didn't have much value. And there were two very specific positive outcomes from that effort. One, Pony Pasture Rapids, which is now one of the most favored spots in the James River Park system, was preserved. And additionally, that led to an effort to request that the General Assembly designate the James as a scenic river, and it established the Fall of the James Scenic River Advisory Committee that's been active since 1972. So those are two very specific outcomes of that protest, although there were some economic concerns as well. Interesting. One of the early advocates had this to say. I discovered this in a file that she had given to me, that Louise Burke had given me. I find that after years of unsuccessfully trying to lose weight, I'm doing it by forgetting to eat. Even my rings don't fit. If we don't win the first round, I may get down to where I ought to be, unless I develop a neurotic appetite to compensate for disappointment. So there was a great deal of passion in those days. Let me let Nathan tell you a little bit about Louise and maybe RB. Yeah.
So yeah, as we said earlier, no shortage of characters that made up the James River Park system in Richmond what it is today. Louise Burke and RB Young were definitely two of those individuals. As Ralph has laid out, they were really the two of the individuals leading the charge on protesting the development, or rather the degradation, of our riverfront. I dare say, Ralph has a beautiful house here, and we probably would not even be sitting here had it not been for Louise Burke and R.B. Young. Louise Burke herself, beyond just being, a passionate advocate for the river, was also a Girl Scout troop leader. And so she was instilling, these same values in her Girl Scout troop, care for the environment, care to push back, against the powers that be when they're working to degrade our environment. And she famously sat with her Girl Scout troop and supposedly in front of the dozers as they were getting ready to begin the work to stop the development of the downtown expressway, or rather the expressway that would have gone from the Pony Pasture area and connecting out to Powhite. And so, through efforts like Louise Burke's and R.B. Young, we now have the area that is known as Pony Pasture, the wetlands, as well as Huguenot Flatwater. These are areas, as Ralph has said, that are one of the most loved areas of the James River Park system today. But as we said earlier, public access wasn't always at the forefront of river access. When the river is being used as a sewer, the last place you want to go is to jump in. But over time, the health of the river improved due to efforts by Newton and Caro, Louise Burke and R.B. Young, being able to ensure that the public knew the importance that the river could play in the community, and what a gem that we actually had here in the city of Richmond. But trespass, was if you wanted to use the river, in the early days of the park, the only way to do it was trespass. One river user famously was quoted, "It's difficult to explain to people now that before the 1970s, we couldn't get to the river without trespassing on somebody's property." That is really hard to imagine now. The James River Park system itself, with the multitude of access points over 15 different locations along the riverfront, it is really hard to imagine a time where people didn't have access to the river. That is a very interesting point. And how did that change, though? That changed because people cared. The stretches of the river that you're seeing now, the one on the left where the tower is, this area came to be in the early 1960s due to efforts from well-meaning individuals who ended up purchasing many of the islands and riverfront properties along the stretch of the river, and ended up donating it to the city of Richmond because, you know what, they knew that it was going to become a park. And wow, what a wonderful place this could be if only we could transform this into a space that people would want to be in. So they did that. And that became the beginnings of the James River Park system back in 1960. From there, the community really stepped up. 1960s into the 70s, the park system was about 200 acres. It had, at that point, about 15 staff members. However, 1980s came about. And at that point, Reagan came into power. Started to employ Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, didn't quite trickle down to Richmond. And because of that lack of a trickle, the staff went from 15 to one person. That one person was Ralph White. Ralph White was the individual who really set the vision for the James River Park system as this urban wilderness, this oasis, this escape from the humdrums of your everyday environment in downtown Richmond. You're looking at a picture of the access point at Pony Pasture built by volunteers. That's the critically important part here because when the park went from having 15 staff members to one, well, you all are river managers. You all are natural resource managers as well. You recognize that you never have enough staff, but what you do have is a passionate cadre of volunteers, community members who care about these spaces and they want to make them better. The put-in that you saw earlier, the put-in that you're looking at here, which is at 14th Street, which is at the bottom of the fall line, these were built by volunteers, built, paid for, designed by volunteers. Some staff was there. There are 2 staff members. You might recognize one of the individuals in the forefront there as myself. but the community is really who came together and made many of the access points, the trail systems that you see here in the park system, the climbing sites, basically, you name it, it was built by a community member who stepped up to the plate and said, you know what, I care about this space. I've got some time, I've got some skills. How can I help you? And now, once access was granted, once access was developed, they came, and they came in droves. As I stated earlier, today, the James River Park System boasts of over 2 million visitors a year. Many of the activities center around the river, but again, take place off river as well, in the form of mountain biking, hiking, trail running, nature appreciation, rock climbing, sunbathing, of course, rafting and canoeing, as we have class 4 rapids that run through the middle of our downtown. One of the only capital cities in America to be able to boast that. Literally, in order for you to have class 4 rapids, to have capital city, to have nesting pairs of bald eagles in one place, and especially in a capital city, you got to go to Juneau, Alaska to get that, and we got it right here in the city of Richmond. The riverfront plays this just tremendous overarching space that allows for many of us again to gain that appreciation for the river, for the natural environment, and being in the environment. Examples are plentiful, from folks that are using the river for subsistence fishing, to folks that are out recreationally fishing, to folks that are just out enjoying the riverfront in all its glory. This is a segment of North Bank Trail and a climbing site on Belle Isle. Again, really highlighting the important role that the riverfront and its amenities play in our community. It can't be overstated how the James River Park System functions as this great melting pot for our community. It's not just certain segments of the population that are using our riverfront, it's everyone in the city of Richmond. It's enjoyed by young, old alike. But the early park issues, how they developed, or how nature should it be? That was the eternal question. How do we balance recreational access, recreational amenities, access to the river with this want to have a natural space, a place that we can get away from? I feel that as over the years, the park has really been able to strike that balance, but that balance has been struck wholly through the input from the community. The development of the James River Park System over the years really came from the community. The original documents for how the park was to be developed was envisioned to be a very hardscape space. There would have been concrete walkways along the edge of the river instead of a natural walkway. There would have been paved pathways that took you out to islands in the middle of the river with camping facilities. Belle Isle famously would have had a monorail that came in from downtown Richmond out to the island, and as well as a Space Needle-like structure out there with the revolving restaurant. Again, luckily, or when 1980s hit and all the money dried up, none of that happened. And as a result, we began to really look at, what makes this space unique? What is one of the drivers for our community and why this would be important for us to preserve? And so from there began to strike this balance of, access as well as, the natural experience. And as I said early on, today, because of this, we've struck this balance between access and nature. We're able to boast that the city of Richmond hosts a little bit of wilderness in the heart of the city, with much habitat for not just us animals who enjoy recreation, but for the wildlife and abundance of wildlife. Again, I talk about striking that balance between access and nature. Few places have really been able to achieve that, as well as the James River Park System has, with nesting pairs of bald eagles right in the middle of our capital city, osprey, cormorants, great blue herons, apex predators, otters, coyote, spotted salamanders, which is also the logo of the Friends of the James River Park System, mink that have been found in the park. And so again, striking this balance doesn't have to be this either or scenario. You don't have to sacrifice all of nature just to have access, and you don't have to sacrifice access so that you can preserve nature. There can be this balance that gets struck. And of course, we've got our invasives as well. These are American geese at this point, as many of them no longer enjoy flying back up to Canada. We've got an abundance of food here and with the health of the river, so they stick around. And as I said earlier, with almost 2 million visitors to the James River Park System in 2019 and even more in 2020, literally what we've seen this year over COVID has really been parks have saved people's lives. Let that sink in for a second. We know this is a place where just spending a few minutes in nature can decrease your blood pressure, can change your mood, and talk about health disparities and the like. People are finding not just James River Park System, but many of our parks across the Commonwealth as places of refuge to gather their thoughts, maybe even hug a tree because you haven't got a chance to hug a person in a while, and really have really been able to save. I know it saved me, and I'm sure it saved many other people this year. And so the importance that parks play in our communities cannot be understated. And I'll hand it back over to Ralph so you can talk about dams.
Richmond has 5 major dams. Once upon a time, building dams was a sign of progress. Now removing dams is considered progress. In Richmond, that got started with a resolution and some funding by the General Assembly that was concerned about the anadromous fish and they're being prevented from going upstream to their spawning grounds. So that got a process started, and all 5 of the dams ultimately were breached in one way or another. Manchester and Browns Island dams were the first breached by direct human impact in 1989. Some explosions were used to breach the dams, those 2 dams. Nature took care of a dam upstream near North Belle Isle, the North Belle Isle Dam, that was breached by the Camille flood in 1969 and has continued to widen as time has gone on. Z Dam, built to push water over so they can go into the city's water supply system, was breached in 1993 with a notch in the dam. Bosher's Dam was a bigger problem because it was larger, and just blowing a hole in it wouldn't work, or cutting a notch in it wouldn't work. So a fishway was constructed. There were many delays in creating that fishway. It cost a lot of money, cost more than expected, and both public and private funds were used. There was weather delays and a variety of others, but finally it was completed in 1997. The hope was that lots of American shad would head on upstream into their native spawning grounds, and that seemed to be the case right at the beginning, but that gradually began to peter out, and eventually the number of shad going upstream just declined to such a point that the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, which had been stocking upstream, decided to discontinue. So thus far, the dam breaching for purposes of shad running upstream has not been successful, but even some of the experts think that maybe one day it will work, that they will come back. Floods, another big issue. The floods, the Camille flood in 1969 and the Agnes flood in 1972 did major damage downtown and started a process in which the city attempted to do something about flooding. There was a Corps of Engineers study. There was a committee and a variety of folks in Richmond who lobbied Congress for 20 plus years, and ended up a wall was built. Some of us are not all that enthusiastic about walls as a way to deal with floods, because after all, despite the name of the River Management Society, rivers are basically unmanageable in the way that sometimes the Corps of Engineers would like to manage them. And I'm personally of the belief this is not the kind of visual shoreline that I would like to see along Richmond. But nevertheless, we've got flood walls in the downtown, no longer floods. The downtown riverfront is an area separate from the park, although now it is very much a part of the overall ambiance of the park-like setting along the James River in Richmond. The downtown riverfront had been built on many, many times. It was not just natural trees. As Brenton Halsey said, in the 20th century, Richmond turned its back on the river and buried its riverfront in dilapidated industry, railroads, highways, and general neglect, exacerbated by frequent flooding. And there was a lot of shoreline clutter. Here are just a few examples of the clutter that existed along the shoreline in downtown Richmond. As you can see on the right, the canals that was James River and Kanawha Canal, and a section that was filled in, and as a matter of fact, is still filled in. The strategy for dealing with the downtown riverfront was really twofold. One was to remove that industrial clutter, which turned into a multi-million-dollar project, and then to use the restored canals as the connection to the river. Here's a photo of the Belle Isle cleanup back in the day, and the construction of the canal. The new canals were constructed sometimes where the old canal existed and sometimes in newer locations. This happens to be not where the James River and Kanawha Canal was, but the Hacksaw Mill Race in the downtown area. This is where two projects came together: a sewer pipe and the bed of the canal. They ended up killing two birds with one stone, so to speak, and saving some money in that process. The Great Basin, the picture to the upper left, was once at the center of downtown Richmond. The Great Basin then became a parking lot, and now it's a high-rise hotel and business center. But we have a new basin, a new turning basin for the recreational boats. Browns Island, one of the key locations along the riverfront. Lots of festivals are held here. You can see what it was like at one time on the left during its industrial period and what it looks like today on the right-hand picture. The canal walk, a key feature now of downtown and a key connection to the river. Very enjoyable place to visit. Teapot Dam Walk, the first major project of the 2012 Riverfront Plan. Now we even have restaurants where we can sit alongside the river and have lunch or dinner, something that was not the case for a long period of time. In addition to all those things, the downtown riverfront has become a showcase for history. And let me let Nathan talk a little bit about that. And we'll try to move this along fairly quickly because I'm sure time is beginning to ebb.
So America's founding river, the James River, and Richmond is steeped in its history. The picture you see here is of Christopher Newport's cross there along the Hacksaw Canal Mill Race. Roughly in this area is where it's believed that Christopher Newport, as he was exploring the James River, placed a cross in order to, as a mapping tool, and to know where he had been and been able to navigate. And so this history kind of continues. But really, Richmond, you can't say Richmond without saying how it was the capital of the South during the Confederacy. And all of the trappings that come along with that. But when we speak of the river, few people were revered as kings of the river more than Bateaumen. Bateaumen during this time were either freed Blacks or enslaved Blacks. But these individuals were some of the only people that were able to navigate the river, and especially the river rapids, bringing goods down from the western regions of the state into markets here in Richmond. These individuals would be on the river for a couple days to a couple weeks. And essentially, they had no oversight. They had nobody with them. It was just them, their boat, and their oar, as well as their goods, making their way down to Richmond. Again, few people could have done this at that point in time, but African Americans were able to do it. The Richmond Slave Trail is also here in Richmond. Really, we can tell the story of America from the slave ship to the White House right here in Richmond. Literally, slave ships from Africa, but mainly slave ships that resold Americans, resold people that were born here in America to other places in the South, originated here in Richmond. One of the most notorious slave jails here in the city of Richmond and downtown Richmond was known as Devil's Half Acre, or Lumpkin's Jail. Lumpkin's Jail at that point in time was a very foul place to be, especially if you were an enslaved individual. There has been some archaeological digs that happened there, but the space after Lumpkin died, his wife, who he married, which was African American, began a school for freed Blacks. That school for freed Blacks turned into Virginia Union University. Virginia Union University graduated Douglas L. Wilder, the first African American governor in America. Literally, from the slave ship to the White House, we can tell that story right here in Richmond. We all know the story of Henry Box Brown. You learned that in school, right? Well, on our downtown riverfront, you can go climb in a box that was roughly the same size as the box that he used to ship himself to freedom. The story is told there on the box, as well as inscriptions on the ground. But you'll typically, you'll go past there and you'll see school groups, you'll see kids, you'll see adults climbing inside of there, and seeing just how cramped it was and the experience that this individual would have gone through to get his freedom. As we said, we were the capital of the Confederacy. And our riverfront was an industrial riverfront at that point in time. The site that you're looking at here would have been where the Confederate Naval Yard would have been, which is now known as Shiplock Park. There would have been a number of boats that have been built there at that point in time and used during the Civil War. Of course, Tredegar Iron Works was a central part of munitions manufacturing during this period as well. Early on in the Civil War, they sold munitions to both the North and South, but as the war carried on, they began to only sell munitions to the South, as they were located in Richmond. So you'll see kind of Tredegar Iron Works kind of through time there, with the top left being, as it was, during historic periods, and lower being in its derelict period, and now to where it is as being a part of the National Park Service, as well as being a part of the overall museums that tell the story here in Richmond about the Civil War and Richmond's role. At the end of the Civil War, the Confederates needed to escape, and as they were escaping, they burned down most of their city. And needed to come back and rebuild. If you go out to the Potterfield Memorial Bridge, you'll walk across the 3 Days in April interpretive segment, which really outlines the story of the evacuation of Richmond at that point in time. Again, you can't come to Richmond and you can't talk about the history of Richmond without the Civil War playing a prominent part in it. This plaque recognizes the fact that Belle Isle was actually used as a prisoner of war camp for Northern soldiers, and actually was one of the worst prison camps during that period. thousands of Northern soldiers died at that camp on Belle Isle itself. As again, continuing through the evacuation of Richmond, all of these things can be seen from the T. Tyler Pollerfield Memorial Bridge. And down at Shiplake Park, again, canal system played a huge role here in the city of Richmond, and how could we navigate around the rapids in order to bring goods to market. And the canal system, the Kanawha Canal, was one of the most famous at that point in time. The Kanawha Canal, which was originally surveyed by George Washington himself, who also happened to be one of the first presidents of the Virginia Canal Navigation Society's president. Also, as the story goes, famously came to this location here at Pump House Park, which is known as Washington's Arch. Washington Arch is the arch that you see there. As the story goes, he came to the city of Richmond via the canal to meet with the city council. However, they stood him up. And he ended up eating a sandwich at this arch alone. That's how the story goes, and as it is. But as we again, the history of the bridges that cross the river, the one on the left would have been a railroad bridge that would have spanned the river. The one on the right being 14th Street Bridge. It's at the bottom of the fall line itself. And of course, the Pump House. Pump House Park. This was Richmond's first water pumping station. The building itself was designed and built by Colonel Cutshaw. There was, as you can imagine, a lot of labor went into building a structure of this caliber. So, you had many Irishmen there, you had many, some freed blacks, some enslaved blacks that were there as well, who were rented out for industry. This building is today being worked on for renovation to bring it back to life. To allow the open air dance floor that you see in the top to be used again as an event space, an interpretive space to tell the history of the canals here in Richmond. And I'll hand it back to Ralph to talk about view sheds.
One of the great things about rivers in general, and certainly about the James River, are the views that it offers. And the river, in fact, was appreciated going back historically for views. This site, as the story goes, is the view that named the city, the view that named Richmond, based upon a similar view at Richmond upon Thames in England. Whether the story is factually accurate or a legend is sometimes open to debate, but if it's a legend, it's a great legend. This is that view a few years ago when Lehigh cement towers were still in place, and that view now that those cement towers have been taken down. But the city offers, the river offers all kinds of views, long distance views from the middle of the river. One of the great joys in going down, paddling the river, is going through this area where you can not even tell that you're in a city, and then the city begins to emerge off on the horizon. And views from office buildings and conference rooms for those who are lucky enough to have this. This is the Dominion Energy conference room, one of the best views of the river in Richmond. And there are lots of up close views. It doesn't have to be large panoramic ones to be really intriguing and beautiful. Lots of nice up close views. One of the things I most like about the river, the visual aspects of the river, I call it views as art, in which people take very artistic photographs or paint. Both painting and photography are used to capture the beauty of the river. Some of these are just a very small number of ones that I happen to like, as showing how artistic the river can be if you know how to use the camera. The well-known railroad bridge that shows up frequently in photographs. Very nice job that for most of those photos, by the way, were not taken by me. I don't get up early enough to take good pictures. You have to get up early to get your best pictures, photographers tell me. And so I haven't made it yet. One of the features of the river is really, we think those are kind of a new way of thinking about the river. And let me let Nathan bring things to a conclusion here with some thoughts about a new river ethos.
And yes, you know, we've kind of gone through the span of the history of the riverfront here in Richmond, from you know, its industrial uses to its now reborn recreational uses. And all of this has generated this new river ethos for members of the community here in Richmond and beyond. The river is valued. We've been able to understand, you know, what that value of a park system is to a community. As I mentioned earlier, the James River Park System is estimated value, economic impact value is at $33.5 million to the city of Richmond. Again, as I said earlier, the park doesn't charge you anything to come and enjoy it. Just ask that you pick up your trash and, you know, and care for it a little bit. But that wasn't always the case. But now that we understand the economic value that this space brings to the community, we also understand its recreational value, the health, the naturalness and beauty of the river are prominent and protected. These are key, you know, elements, you know, of this new river ethos. The understanding that we are people of and by the river here in Richmond really is what I think sets Richmond apart from many communities. We see ourselves as an active community because of all of this, you know, the access that we have to recreational amenities with 40+ miles of mountain biking and hiking trails here in the city of Richmond, 2 outdoor rock climbing sites, Class 1 through Class 4 rapids. You know, there is any number of activities you can do from one spot within the James River Park System. But there's still a whole lot more to do. You know, the health of the river, the James River Association, you know, most recently rated it as a B-. You know, for those of you that live in states that rate your restaurants, I dare say that, you know, if you go into your restaurant and you see a B- on the window, you may or may not eat there. So we're always striving for that the A rating. And so we continue to do work to improve the quality of the waterfront, as well as, you know, dealing with runoff and, you know, effluent, things like that, point source and non-point source sources of pollution that are affecting the quality of our rivers. There's a riverfront plan, as Ralph mentioned. There's a downtown riverfront plan. The downtown riverfront plan really focuses on the area from about, you know, Belle Isle east of the riverfront. Well, that part of the plan hasn't been fully realized yet. While some elements of the plan have been implemented, like the T. Tyler Potterfield Memorial Bridge, other aspects are still lagging and behind in their development, as well as implementing the full James River Park Master Plan. The James River Park Master Plan was developed by the Friends of James River Park, recognizing that there hadn't been a master plan for one of the most important features in the city of Richmond in over 50 years, and decided to do something about it. So they raised over $250,000 to engage with a contractor, VHB, in order to assist us in developing a new vision for the James River, the riverfront in the city of Richmond, one that incorporates all of the city, not just certain segments. This is an important element because the new river ethos in Richmond really is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we ensure that all individuals here in the city of Richmond are able to take advantage of this riverfront and this beautiful place that we all know and love? We still have communities along our riverfront that are identified in the James River Park Master Plan that do not have a riverfront park. The 8th district within the city of Richmond, which is a riverfront district, has 0 riverfront access. The James River Park System identifies city-owned parcels that should be turned into access points, not only for this community, but for other individuals who would like to visit the river in this part of the city. And so really ensuring that everyone has an appreciation and understanding and is able to use our riverfront here in the city of Richmond is one of the most paramount things going forward that really has defined how the riverfront here in Richmond is to be developed in the future and is to be maintained as a public space for all. With that, I think we just landed the plane. So,
and dramatically, we would say that the vision of a Richmond centered on the James pleases the eye and invigorates the spirit. And we thank you very much for your kind attention.
Ralph and Nathan, thank you all so much for that. If we have about 5 more minutes, in case there's anyone in the audience that has some questions or comments. We do have our first comment that garden clubs are real power in Virginia. And I think you all and Scenic Virginia and others has found that to be the case. We have another comment. Thank you for such an interesting presentation. Thank you very much. That's it. So I think the only comment then would be if people are interested in the master plan, they can go on the city's website, right, and see what's going on with that.
yes, you can go to Friends of James River Park. They have not only the park master plan, but they also have the economic impact studies, plethora of information about the James River Park system, where you can go to enjoy it, how to plan out your time there. And yeah, definitely visit Friends of James River Park system.
Okay, snorkeling in the James and RVA is the best. Who would have thought you could do that in the downtown city?
Absolutely.
Awesome job. You all rock it. Great presentation. Well done. So thank you both for an excellent presentation. For those of you in the audience, if you go through Guidebook, you can reach out to both Ralph and Nathan any other time during the course of this event. You see their direct emails there. And gentlemen, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. And
Well,
if you
thank
just hang around for 2 or 3 minutes in case there's something else, we'll do that. And then for everyone else, there's a 15-minute break. And then at 12:30, you can all go into your different sessions. Hands up. Yeah, you guys did great.
Thank you,
so much.
guys.
Great job. I love visiting Richmond and the riverfront.